the establishment, central federal government wants to go after all those anti-federalist people, those survivalist, libertarian types, motorcycle gangs, and they're all armed to the teeth. We have 400 million weapons circulating in America. The Second Amendment is one of the most prized constitutional protection as far as those people are concerned. And they know very well, in their own words, that the Democrats are coming out for their guns. So if there is even the perception that they were robbed again of their ability to cast a meaningful vote, and thereby with the extension that their country is being taken away from them, they will retaliate in force. In what state will this happen? Well, in very red states, most likely Texas. Texas may try to secede. Florida, Oklahoma, Mississippi, but also states like Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. We can expect the United States to, at some point, start fragmenting, and ultimately, with the federal government trying to keep all the pieces together by force, we may witness a descent into civil war. So this election is very important in more than one aspect, because it could be, if it's held, and it's held in the circumstances that are reminiscent of 2020, we could see, interestingly enough, as the late Vladimir Zhirinovsky once said, but also was echoed by former Russian President Medvedev, to the fragmentation of the United States, and ultimately its implosion. Some would say explosion, I would say implosion. They will implode from within. In a way, this presents opportunities for the rest of the world, because one, the Americans are too concerned about trying to survive as a political entity. The imperial aspect of it will collapse as well, for there won't be any funds or any concerted political attempt to keep those 1,000 bases around the world functioning. So it depends how you look at the situation. It's either a glass half full or half empty. Half empty in the sense also that nobody wants to see a country with 5,000 nuclear warheads, going into collapse. So we'll have to monitor and observe the situation there very carefully. This being said, if there was to be a contested election in 2024, and it's very likely that it would be the case, owing to the no less than 11 million people who have entered the United States illegally since 2021 and the arrival of Joe Biden in the White House, we can expect major fraud to take place again. For the simple reason that Donald Trump might be compatible on some issues with the establishment, but he has this thing that the establishment loses, is that they have no grip on him. He's independently wealthy, so he's not catering to special interest necessarily. And most important to them, he's too crude in how he announces what he's going to do. It might surprise our viewers, but the American deep state, as it were, favors a more, should I say, polished approach to presenting themselves to the world, even though the end result is the same. And Donald Trump does not fit within the way they want to do it. Not to mention Donald Trump having been raised by, professionally coached and groomed by former attorney, the late Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was the wingman of the late Senator Joe McCarthy during the Red Scare, the Red Hunt, hunting for communists, real and or imagined, back in 1950s. So someone who had no compulsion about lying and destroying people's career, if not destroying people altogether, in order to prop himself up. This is the man who, back in the 70s, groomed Donald Trump. And one of the things that Roy Cohn taught Trump was that he should always exact revenge on the people that have attempted to move against him. So that's another reason why everything will be done in a way to prevent Donald Trump from getting back into the Oval Office, because his political enemies know that he's coming out for them. No two nation states share the exact same national interest. That's the fundamental premise. And so they understand that you may share some commonalities with any given state, depending on the circumstances, but you cannot attach yourself, your national security interest, to another state's own subjective national security interest. Unfortunately, this is what seems to have happened in a very steady but progressive fashion since 1967 and the Six-Day War. And now we find, since 2001, September 11, 2001, pretty much almost two foreign policy of, on one hand, the United States, and on the other hand, the State of Israel, are fundamentally one and the same. And so this implies that fundamentally, if one falls down, the other one follows. If one wins out, the other one wins out as well, or so they think, because obviously war is all about the loss of blood and treasure. And so some partner, junior partner, might benefit from it, at least on the surface of things. And when we start looking at the details, obviously it's always the people who suffers, but the people over there are also completely brainwashed. And in America, this jingoism, hyper-nationalistic tendency, which betrays a lack of self-confidence, will also lead to very bad results. No two nation states share the exact same national interest. That's the fundamental premise. And so they understand that you may share some commonalities with any given state, depending on the circumstances, but you cannot attach yourself, your national security interest, to another state's own subjective national security interest. Unfortunately, this is what seems to have happened in a very steady but progressive fashion since 1967 and the Six-Day War. And now we find, since 2001, September 11, 2001, pretty much almost two foreign policy of, on one hand, the United States, and on the other hand, the State of Israel, are fundamentally one and the same. And so this implies that fundamentally, if one falls down, the other one follows. If one wins out, the other one wins out as well, or so they think, because obviously war is all about the loss of blood and treasure. And so some partner, junior partner, might benefit from it, at least on the surface of things. And when we start looking at the details, obviously it's always the people who suffers, but the people over there are also completely brainwashed. And in America, this jingoism, hyper-nationalistic tendency, which betrays a lack of self-confidence, will also lead to very bad results. Well, I guess the first thing one has to ask is, what kind of American? There are two types of American. The first type is what's called the evangelist American. Those people are essentially working class, white workers, blue collar, who were somehow the victim of the globalization 30 years ago, when the country's elite deindustrialized the United States in order to enrich themselves even more so, at the expense of the then middle class and upper working class. So those people are pretty much living in what this French writer called La Périphérie, and Christophe Joly is the author's name. They pretty much despise the urban centers, and they are very receptive to what we call the dispensation doctrine in Protestant circles. To make a long story short, Protestant circles follow the Scofield Bible, and it's heavily oriented toward the Old Testament, meaning that it's all about fire and fury, and basically they want to hasten the return of Christ, and in so doing, precipitate Armageddon. So there's about 100 million of those people in America, mostly, again, as I said earlier, in the Bible Belt and the Rust Belt. Many of them vote Trump, as they voted for George Bush Jr. And they have infested all the institutional branches of the United States federal government, including the military. Well, I guess the first thing one has to ask is what kind of American? There are two types of American. The first type is what's called the evangelist American. Those people are essentially working class white workers, blue collar, who were somehow the victim of the globalization 30 years ago when the country's elite deindustrialized the United States in order to enrich themselves even more so at the expense of the then middle class and upper working class. So those people are pretty much living in what this French writer called La Périphérie, and Christophe Joly is the author's name. They pretty much despise the urban centers, and they are very receptive to what we call the dispensation doctrine in Protestant circles. To make a long story short, Protestant circles follow the Scofield Bible, and it's heavily oriented toward the Old Testament, meaning that it's all about fire and fury, and basically they want to hasten the return of Christ, and in so doing, precipitate Armageddon. So there's about 100 million of those people in America, mostly, again, as I said earlier, in the Bible Belt and the Rust Belt. Many of them vote Trump, as they voted for George Bush Jr. And they have infested all the institutional branches of the United States federal government, including the military. We have the neoconservative, who pretty much control U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. And neoconservative, they are neither Bible Belt nutcases or progressive per se. They are fellow travelers. Most of them are, first and foremost, creatures of the swamp, creatures of the foggy bottoms, Washington, D.C. establishment. There's a nickname for them, which is chicken hawks. They never fought any wars themselves, but they basically take it upon themselves to impose what they believe is the democratic values all around the world by the force of arms, if necessary. But with the cynical side aspect of it is that they enrich themselves because they all have shares in weapons manufacturing companies. So that's the case we saw in Ukraine with Victoria Nuland, who basically is the point person in the State Department, and her husband, Robert Kagan, is the interface with Wall Street. So she creates the wars, and Robert Kagan comes in with the Wall Street investors, and they buy all the riches of Ukraine for a cent on a dollar.
Whether a Democrat or a Republican is elected, this country is going to go through a very profound crisis in the near future, very similar, in my opinion, to what the Soviet Union went through and what Russia went through at the beginning of the 1990s. And I think that's unavoidable. It'll happen faster under a Democrat, maybe a little slower under a Republican. If the Republican is Trump, as it looks like it might be, he might actually accelerate the process because if he gets elected, this country is going to burn. It's going to go through what we did in 2020 with the Antifa and the George Floyd riots, except to the nth degree. It'll be much, much more devastating. And of course, the administration will do nothing about it. So we're becoming a very polarized society, and even more so in some states like California, which are essentially turning into a third world country, where you have a very, very rich upper crust that controls everything through various forms of corruption and graft. And then you have a kind of a third world population, many of them imported from outside of the country, and increasingly the middle class and any productive activity being squeezed out. Now, obviously, Elon Musk is not middle class, but his company is something that is one of the productive elements of the American economy. Well, in California, there's no place for you like that. There's no place like that for no place for somebody like that. So, yeah, he's going to move to Texas. Texas is kind of a magnet for normal people in America nowadays. You know, they go to Texas, they go to Idaho, they go to various other states, usually in what they call flyover country, the middle of the country, which is still in many respects the real America, as opposed to the cities on the Pacific coast or the urban northeast part of the United States, which also suggests that if the United States breaks up like the Soviet Union did, that's sort of the natural uh, fissure lines where the country could break up. But obviously, it's more complicated than that because in America, it's not so much regional as it is urban versus rural. American elections are very corrupt nowadays, especially the presidential elections. Local elections, probably not as much, but presidential elections, let's remember, we don't have a single national election. We have 50 state elections. And all you have to do is win some key states. And to win those states, you have to win the vote in certain very big, corrupt Democratic cities that can give you as made ballots as you need made to order. If they make the phone call and say, we need 25,000 ballots, they'll get 25,000 ballots. It's really almost that simple. And that's beyond the question of how the candidates are selected. Now, Trump, I think, was a what we call a fluke, an accident in 2016. He wasn't supposed to get elected. Well, they fixed that problem in 2020. So I think he understood from the beginning that if he wants to win, he has to be allowed to win. And the way he is going to be allowed to win is he's really beating the drums on the Middle East. Israel, 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 Israel. I'm the guy who's going to take out Iran for you. And that's the message he's selling to the system, to the establishment. There is a theory that the Democrats may have given up on beating Trump, and that reflects some deeper movement within the political establishment to say, let's go ahead and let Trump win. Because let's remember, we don't have real elections in this country anymore. The idea that the Democrats need to win an election to win an election is simply not true. That if Trump wins, It's because somebody decided to let him win. And that may be because the establishment wants to change its focus from Europe toward the Middle East and China, so that instead of confronting Russia, we're going to attack Iran. We're going to have a war with China. That's where their focus is. And maybe they consider Trump more reliable in that regard than they do Biden. There are a lot of variables here and a lot of things that are beyond what you can see in public. All they want to do is find some way to put the Ukraine war on ice for a while, in a way that NATO doesn't collapse, they don't suffer an Afghanistan type humiliation, and so they can shift their focus to the Middle East and to the Western Pacific. So that's all the more reason why, if they are thinking clearly in Moscow, they should be thinking they do want to inflict an Afghanistan style humiliation, that the Ukrainian state collapses and then NATO probably falls apart at that point. That's, I think, imperative if we're going to avoid a much bigger global war. But I don't make the policy of the Kremlin. So we'll find out what they decide to do. But in any case, yeah, I think there are bigger imperatives behind this, behind the aside from the 35 to 40% of the population that really, 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 really loves Trump and thinks he's the orange Jesus, and the other 35 to 40% of the population that hates Trump and thinks he's the orange Hitler.